So I hope I confused you last lecture, and I'm going to have another go today. This time talking about whether you can freely choose to do things, and if so, what are the consequences for being held responsible for what you've done. So let me first ask you some questions to talk about the person next to you. Do you think there's a reason why anything happens? In other words, everything has a cause. For example, there is a reason why it is sunny one day and not the next. There's a reason why the house creaked at night. And there's a reason why your friend made the decision that she did. So just briefly say to the person next to you, introduce yourselves if you don't know each other. Well, just introduce yourselves anyway, remind each other of your names. And say what you think. Is there a reason for everything that happens? All right. So now I'll ask you another question. Do you agree that you can sometimes choose freely in a way that is not determined? In other words, you could have chosen otherwise. It was up to you what the choice was. You could have chosen this, you could have chosen that. So if you think back to your first bite of food today, could you have chosen not to have that particular food, but something else, or indeed nothing at all? Was that up to you? You could have made that choice. You could have done something different. And when you chose to get up at the time you did, could you have chosen to stay in bed just that bit longer and get up a bit later? And imagine some movement you could do with your hand right now. You could move it up, move it sideways. Could you choose any one of them? It was free to you what movement you're going to do. Just say what you think to the person next to you. Okay, so maybe you had the intuition that you could have done otherwise, and I think one reason we have this intuition is that we entertain the possibilities in our mind. If indeed we are entertaining possibilities, but we can do so. I can say of my hand up, or I can say sideways. And I can think of up and sideways, and I think, which one shall I do? So the possibilities are there consciously in my mind when I make my choice. But how can both of these things be true? So this way of phrasing the free will problem I've taken from Sean Nichols in this readable book, which claims we just have these conflicting intuitions. We have the intuition that everything happens for a reason. We want there to be a reason for why stuff happens. On the other hand, we have this feeling that our decisions are freely made, at least sometimes. So how can both be true? And that's the free will problem. So what I'm going to do is to go through some of the suggested solutions to this problem. And I'm going to start with something called compatibilism. And the reason why I'm going to start with that is that goes back to the Stoics, 300 BC, where we have a discussion of issues which, while not quite framed exactly like we framed them now, are very much to do with the issues that we're talking about now. We do see discussion of these issues further back in India in the Buddhist scriptures. So, presuming, as are written down, they're a faithful representation of what happened 500 or so BC, people debated these issues as well. Indeed, if these intuitions we're talking about are fundamental human intuitions, it stands to reason that as soon as people started thinking about them, they wondered how to resolve them. So, compatibilism. So the Stoics were determinists, but they also believed people were morally responsible, and they also believed that some people were free at the same time as there was determinism. But there was an argument about this. As I was saying, there's conflicting intuitions, and wherever there's conflicting philosophical intuitions, you get people coming down on different sides of the argument. So one of the arguments against the Stoics is called the idle argument, or the lazy man argument. If everything is fated, it will be pointless to make any effort to do anything. If it is fated that you will or will not recover from an illness, there's no point contacting the doctor. You're going to recover or not, that's fate. But there is a point contacting the doctor, that you should do it if you're really ill. So therefore things are not fated. Put like that, I don't regard this as a particularly knockdown argument, but I hope you see the intuition here that if people believed in fate, it might sap them of the will to do things, but we should be doing things. And that sort of idea was resurrected in recent times with the notion of free will priming, or priming determinism. So what researchers did was to give people some essay written by, say, a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist like Francis Crick, claiming that everything is determined and you don't have free will. Then they would see what effect this essay would have on how people would behave. Would it change their belief in determinism and free will? And it turns out that it can. So that could just be demand characteristics, but at least people rate their beliefs of having changed. And then the claim was this can lead to antisocial, lazy, cheating types of behaviour. I had noted in this literature that attempts to replicate, found it rather difficult to replicate these effects, and I found this 2021 meta-analysis looking at all the literature. And said, while people's rated beliefs in free will and determinism will change after you've given them an essay by Francis Crick or something similar, but as I say, that could be demand characteristics. The other carry-on effects, they couldn't find evidence when you put all the experiments together. So it may not be the case, at least the way belief in free will is manipulated in these experiments, that it really does have any effect on how lazy you are or how willing you are to cheat, or how antisocial you'll be. Nonetheless, you can probably sort of feel the point of the argument. Chrysippus was one of the major intellectuals in the Stoic movement, and this was his reply. He said, well, things are co-fated. That means they're fated to happen together. And these are some of his examples. If it is fated that Oedipus will be born to Laius, that is because it is also fated that Laius has intercourse with a woman. It's not as if Oedipus is going to pop into existence without natural cause. And it may be fated you will recover from your illness, but that's because it is also fated you will contact the doctor. In other words, determinism works through you as much as through anything else. So it might be determined that you're going to win the wrestling in the Olympics, but that's because you're going to work bloody hard to make that happen, which is also fated. So here's another argument that, again, resonates with more recent thinking. If everything is fated, then the misdeeds of people should not be attributed to them and their wills. Now remember, the Stoics had this theory of the mind that what the outside world sort of gives you, as it were, is impressions. And you can assent to these impressions. In other words, you give your agreement to them, and then they become part of your thinking. And some of those impressions are sort of imperative. They have an urging to action aspect to them. And when you assent to one of these, that makes that action happen. That's an intention. But these impressions in people's minds are fated, like everything else, and so is their assent to those impressions. The whole process is fated. So people should not be punished. I mean, if everything is determined, why should we punish anybody for things that were determined anyway? Or reward them? But the argument when people should be punished, surely that's obvious. So not everything is fated. Chrysippus said, and this very much is the flavour of modern compatibilist thinking as well, our characters have been fated, yes. But that's fine. Because if in a given situation someone with a different character would have done otherwise, but we with our character do the decision that we did do, that shows the decision can be attributed to us. So note, this isn't, at this point there wasn't the notion of you could do otherwise. It was someone else could do otherwise in that same situation. That was the important thing. As long as someone else would do otherwise in that situation because of their moral character, then clearly that person is responsible for what happened. He used the analogy of a cylinder. If you give a cylinder a push, it rolls down the hill. And it rolls down the hill because of its nature, because it's cylindrical and rollable. And so it rolls because of its nature. In that sense, it's responsible for the continuing rolling that happens. And so when an outside impression is made on us, and we have this impression in our mind, how we react to it depends on our nature. And it's because we do things, because of our moral nature, that's why we have a certain moral responsibility. And surely you want your decisions to reflect your character. So not that I'm aware Chrysippus put it quite this way, but just imagine you did something randomly. Just some quantum event, bang, and you do something else. That would seem odd. And why should you be held responsible for that? It seems better to say we're held responsible for what we do because it was in line with our character. But this isn't to do with being free. So you might have the notion that we should be held responsible for things that we are free to do. And Chrysippus accepted that in terms of external constraint on you. If you're tied to a chair, you can't be held responsible for not helping the victim. Yeah, that's true. That sense of freedom. But Stoic freedom didn't quite mean that. Stoic freedom means that you make the right decisions to live a good life. And if you remember the Stoic lecture, that means assenting to the impressions which are true and rejecting those which are not true. So if you assent to the impression that this muffin is delicious and I must eat it for my happiness, then you're assenting to a false impression, and that's a passion. But if you say, well, this muffin is good for my health, it's a blueberry one after all, and I will eat it, Zeus willing. Of course, something might get in the way, but that's fine. My happiness depends only on me making the right decisions. And then you eat the muffin. That's fine. Then you are free, in the Stoic sense. So the Stoic sense means of freedom is not inconsistent with determinism. In fact, it requires it. Just like a computer, to make the right decisions requires the causal mechanisms operate as they should, otherwise it's not going to be making the right decision. So for the sage to be making the right decisions that lead to flourishing, which is freedom, it's the freedom to make the right decisions that lead to flourishing. And so you need a causal mechanism in place that leads you to make the right decisions. So to sum up what the Stoics argued, the world is deterministic. So to go back to the claims we're talking about, it agrees with the first one. There is a reason why everything happens. There's a causal web. But we do have moral responsibility. So moral responsibility can be assigned to more or less anyone, any adult anyway, adult human. Because our character causes us to assent to make the actions that we do. It depended on us, our character. And that's true whether or not the person is free. And indeed, most people are not free in the Stoic sense. Only sages are free, and they are precious few. Maybe Socrates was a sage. So that was the position round about 300 BC, at least the Stoic position. And as you see, there was a debate. And that was the Stoic answer. If we move into sort of more modern times, the problem is framed a little bit differently often. Unless you could have done otherwise, unless you were put in exactly the same situation, exactly the same, and you could have moved your hand up, or you could have moved your hand sideways, exactly the same situation, then you are not free, because you are determined. And hence, some say, not responsible. Remember, the Stoic position wasn't if you could do something different, that would be ridiculous. The world is caused, completely, it's deterministic. Put in exactly the same situation, of course you do exactly the same thing. That's a Stoic position. But that doesn't undermine responsibility nor freedom. Around about 300 AD, Alexander said, no, the real issue should be this one. And then this sort of became an issue after that. So I want to give you an argument why this claim could be rejected. So an argument for compatibilism. So imagine Maria here is going to make a decision about whom she wants to date. Now imagine I'm going to bring in some quantum mechanics here, so we can introduce an element of different possibilities. Okay. Now quanta are tiny little things. and you might wonder how tiny little changes could affect our decisions. So one philosopher who thinks about free will, who I'll come to, suggested, well, some neuroscientists say the brain is chaotic. At least they were saying that some time ago. I tried to look up the current state of that. I couldn't find any definitive statement. But what chaos means is you have a deterministic system, and the tiniest of changes in the initial conditions produces categorically different outcomes. And the weather could well be an example of this. A little butterfly, as the cliche goes, could be flapping its wings somewhere, and the weather system changes somewhere else. You get a rainy day or sunny day or a hurricane or something else. And you get chaos when there's a function that stretches some input and folds it back. And that is what you have in the brain. You have non-linear activation functions and neurons, and they feed back. So it seems to me entirely plausible you could have parts of the brain that are chaotic. Now, because chaos depends on, it gives you different answers depending on the tiniest of differences in initial conditions. That means if there's a quantum change in initial conditions somewhere, you're going to get a different outcome. So that's how we can bring in quantum physics. Whether that's indeed how the brain works, you make decisions, that's a completely different matter. But let's just imagine, at least for this decision, it is set up that way. And three possibilities are she could date one of these three people, and if she does, a completely different life follows for her. Let's say. Now I want to bring in just another idea, which is, so quantum physics postulates this wave function, which is the set of different sets of things. And it says this happening, and this happening, and this happening, and this happening. But what does it mean when it says this is happening, and this is happening, this is happening, this is happening? Well, one way of thinking about it, called the many worlds interpretation, is, well, our best theories in science we should take as saying whatever they postulate as existing exists. I think that's reasonable. I rather like that idea. So, quantum physics, one of the best theories we have, says the wave function exists. And the wave function says there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. So, it all exists. And these are the many worlds. So in this world, world 2, she chooses Dudley Do-Right. But notice at this point, she could have chosen Fat Freddy or Wimpy, because she did in other worlds. So naturally she could have done. So in world 2, she could have chosen these. This Maria coming in there, because she did, so she could have. So she had free choice. According to different possibilities being available to you, which was the requirement these incompatibilists were saying, she has free choice, shows she had free choice. But for the Maria in world 2, worlds 1 and 3 make no difference to her. It doesn't matter to her worlds 1 or 3 exist or don't exist. They don't influence her. So if it doesn't make any difference that she really could have done otherwise, in other words, all that matters is what she actually chose. So removing other worlds does not change life in world 2. So why not be a compatibilist? It's exactly the same for world 2, Maria, whether or not worlds 1 and 3 do exist. Let me put this another way. So I said Maria has genuinely different possibilities, various possibilities available to her, so she has a free choice. But world 2 Maria had to happen. It's determined. It's in the wave function. There was always going to be a world 2 Maria. But we've already agreed she had free choice. So determinism does not undermine free choice. Now, as far as I know, this is a novel argument, so it hasn't been through the debate of people who wouldn't want to agree with it to see what they do with it. But I kind of like it. It's kind of different. What it reminds me of, what you will read about when you read up on this, is something called Frankfurt-examples, after the philosopher Frankfurt. 1969, he tried to set up scenarios in a different way, where there was a person could not have done otherwise, but we still want to say they're responsible for their actions. Pin. Now, I'd never remember to give you guys pins unless I put that slide in. So, 1501. Okay, so that's my way of introducing you to compatibilism. What I'd like you to do now, to take stock, is to say to the person next to you, say, what is compatibilism? And then, of the various things I said, was any argument for compatibilism especially interesting to you? Okay, so the basic idea of compatibilism is free will and determinism are compatible. Or in the Stoic case, because I didn't actually quite talk about free will per se, that moral responsibility and determinism is compatible. Or the freedom that comes with being a sage and determinism is compatible. That's the compatibilist position. So it doesn't have to be the case that you could have done otherwise in exactly the same physical situation for you to have free will, according to the compatibilist. As opposed to the compatibilists are the incompatibilists. So they say, by contrast to what I just said, and I give the example of Per Boom here, if the universe is deterministic, we can't have the sort of free will that's required for moral responsibility. So rejects compatibilism. But on the other hand, if you just did things, as I mentioned before, because there was some quantum randomness that made you do this, that's not compatible with moral responsibility either. Why should you be held responsible for a random event? But since the universe is either deterministic or indeterministic, you can't be morally responsible. You don't have free will either way. And what that means is you're not truly deserving, in an ultimate sense, for either praise or blame, for punishment or reward. There's no such thing as just desert, in terms of good or bad. Or basic desert, they often talk about. Notice the desert in this case is one S, rather than this sort of desert. Yeah, but you pronounce it the same way. Given our universe, we don't deserve any desert. Sorry about that. Yeah. And why is that? Because if our reasoning process is causally influenced in a substantial way, or even determined by factors beyond our control, how could we have the sort of control that gives us moral responsibility? So we don't have to phrase it in terms of being able to do otherwise. In other words, you might buy the Frankfurt examples or my many worlds interpretation version of them. You might buy that. And say, well, no, we still don't have moral responsibility, because if the deciding mechanism was influenced and caused by stuff beyond its control, how can it be held responsible for it? I do wonder, actually, if my many worlds case gets around that. Because here, when she makes a decision, this decision, or this decision, it wasn't caused by factors beyond her control. So maybe in the many worlds case, Per Boom, or like incompatibilists, could accept, actually, maybe we do have moral responsibility. Because I don't know who would say that. And when you have many worlds, our intuitions go a bit haywire anyway. But that's maybe a good reason for introducing them. For example, just to pump your intuition on this, imagine some evil scientist had smuggled in some electrodes in your brain and made you do something like eat an enormous number of muffins. And that's the reason why you put on weight. So how could you be held responsible for having eaten all those muffins and now being overweight? Surely it's the evil neuroscientist, much beloved of philosophers, who is responsible. And while there are no such thing as these evil neuroscientists planting electrodes in our brain that can do this sort of thing, nonetheless, our reasoning process is determined by genes, our upbringing, and subsequent experiences, which are ultimately beyond our control. So how can we be blameworthy for what we decide? And one useful distinction here, I think, which might change your intuitions, is that evil neuroscientist controls us. In other words, there's a feedback loop that enables him to move us towards his goals. That's control of us. But our genes and our environment may cause, but they don't control us like that. They don't have goals. In fact, the causal mechanisms that they produce are the means by which anything at all could ever get done. Causal mechanisms are the means by which we do the stuff we want to do. I think that's a big difference. But then I'm a compatibilist. But to go back to the incompatibilists, it's because of this, there's no such thing as basic desert, meaning what you truly deserve. So we should not punish for sheer retribution. And we're not praiseworthy for our achievements. You know that high grade you got? You don't deserve praise for that. And isn't that an argument against incompatibilism? Well, a sort of argument, at least. You might say, to go back to the lazy man argument, that at least we shouldn't, even if we thought it was true, we shouldn't go around telling people that. But Perboom thinks, actually, this could be a good thing. Maybe we can reform how we think and behave in good ways. Because we can still punish if it changes behaviour, deters, or quarantines dangerous people. We just get rid of and try and get rid of in ourselves pure vindictiveness. And okay, you're not praiseworthy for your achievements, but you can still be pleased to achieve what you hoped for. Because you can hope for something to happen and be pleased about it, even if it's just the weather. So why not be pleased with your achievements? And sometimes you feel self-worth for natural ability or beauty. We don't have to base our good appraisals on something just because we were responsible for it, you see. You can still feel good about things that were determined. And then some other things that we could change. How can you feel guilt if you're not blameworthy? How can we forgive if someone's not blameworthy, and so on? But there's equivalent feelings that we could have. You can feel sad at having done a wrong act and resolve to change how you behave, and maybe that's all that's important. And if someone sincerely convinces you they're not going to engage in that bad behaviour again, why not say, okay, maybe we can carry on with this relationship? How can we love someone who does not act out of free will? I quite like this point he makes. Do you want your lover to love you out of free will? Do you want your lover to say, oh, you know what, I just decided not to love you anymore, and bang, it's gone? So maybe ultimate free will is vastly overrated, and we might be better off without thinking that we have it. So that's the incompatibilist position. So would you like to summarise to the person next to you what incompatibilism means? And if an argument there seemed interesting or good to you, say what you thought it was.
Written down, that sounds like but that's ignorant,
Okay, so some interesting points were made as I was wandering around. One was you have more freedom the more you know. If you're ignorant of a possibility, you can't choose it. Does that make sense? But if you're determinist, that doesn't follow, because if you're determinist, you never had freedom anyway. So as soon as you think you can have more freedom because you know more things, and then you have more possibilities, that's being a compatibilist. Another point was about, well, what about an AI device like a robot? When would it be free? And I haven't told you what compatibilists think exactly when things become free. But as a compatibilist, you could build a robot that did have free will, as long as you built in it the things that you need for free will, which should be the ability to consider alternative possibilities and the reasons for them, and then choose on the basis of the reasons. And you might want to say you want some other things, like the reasons are consistent with higher order goals, and things like that. And sometimes people think that you must want what you want in order to be free. So an addict, for example, wants the next cigarette, but doesn't feel free, even though he's acting on a choice based on reasons. But that choice is not consistent with other desires, for example, not to be an addict. So you might want some hierarchy of desires, and for them all to be consistent. That was a Stoic requirement. There must be complete consistency within the system. But once you build that up, you can argue a little bit about the fine details, but something along those lines, choosing amongst possibilities for reasons, then you have free will on a compatibilist view. And maybe you could add in something like sensitivity to consequences. So if it turns out bad, you can change your reasons for doing things. Okay, now the final view I'll consider is libertarianism. It believes with it accepts the incompatibilist position. The incompatibilist, the hard incompatibilist, I just described, says free will and determinism are incompatible. But, indeed, free will and indeterminism are incompatible. But the world is either deterministic or indeterministic, so free will does not exist. So the hard incompatibilist says free will does not exist. The libertarian says, not to be confused with the political libertarian, but the sort of philosophical free will libertarian, says determinism and free will is incompatible, but the world is indeterministic and we do have free will. And so what determinism does is it rules out different open possibilities. What we need for free will is genuine different possibilities ahead of us. If what I decide now is fixed in stone since the beginning of time, how can I ultimately be responsible? Similar sort of claim as the one I said for Perboom. Keynes says, to be ultimately responsible for an action, I must be responsible for anything that is a sufficient cause of it. But, my genes and prenatal environment and so on, and some subsequent experiences are sufficient causes of how I am now, including my decision-making equipment. So since I wasn't responsible for my genes and the beginning of time and everything else that preceded me in the universe, I can't be responsible for my decisions in a deterministic world. So the world must be deterministic for us to have responsibility. But I just said to you, if some random event made me save someone rather than do something selfish, how can I be held responsible for that? It was a random event. So Keynes' first step is to say, well, randomness, we can still be held responsible when there's randomness. If randomness is something we worked to overcome. So if I'm running in a marathon and some radioactivity comes through me and randomly makes my muscle sore or malfunction a bit, but I push through that and win the race, then surely I can be held responsible and rewarded and praised for winning the race because I overcome the randomness. So here was sort of a little act of genius really on Keynes' part to square the circle. He's going to use that idea now to see how we can be truly free in his eyes. So imagine Jane is rushing to a meeting, and it's a very important meeting, and her career prospects depend on her being at this meeting, and she could well be promoted if she does a good job at this meeting. And if she doesn't go, this is going to look terribly bad. And yet there's this person on the street saying, help me. Does she stop and help the person, and thereby miss a meeting? Or does she go to the meeting, get promoted, and let the poor person, bleed to death? So imagine in the brain there's a neural network that considers the reasons and motives to help, and another neural network that's going over the reasons and motives to go to the meeting, and these interact. And they're chaotic systems, like I said before, and ultimately depend on, at a crucial juncture, a quantum bit of randomness. So, these two networks, let's just say, are finely poised. They're very finely balanced, which one she's going to do. And the quantum event, this little quantum random event, in effect then makes one happen and not the other. But notice, whichever decision Jane makes, it was due to her will to overcome the pull of the other, because these two networks are fighting against each other, competing with each other. And when she does make this decision, it was because of the reasons endorsed in that network She can genuinely say, no, I considered these reasons, and these are the reasons why I'm doing it. And in that sense, it was that network won because it overcame the other, including the randomness that was in the system. So she did choose for reasons, but not in a way that was determined. There were genuine possibilities available to her. And in the end, when she does make the decision, she chose it for good reasons, just as the compatibilist ones. But in a way that was not determined, so there were genuine possibilities. He also makes the point that once you've made a decision like this, it can have consequences for how you think. So if she does stop to help the victim, that might make her help victims more often in the future. But then because she's moulded her character with this, you call a self-forming action, it doesn't matter in the future if it's all deterministic. Her character was reformed for something for which she is responsible. So then determinism is fine after that point. So all you need is a few self-forming actions in your life. And if other decisions are more habitual and determined, that's fine, you're still responsible for them. So the indeterminism she has to overcome to make one choice is there because of her desire to make the other choice. So that's the sense in which the randomness is overcome. And remember, we just said that when you overcome randomness, that doesn't stop you from being praised or blamed for your actions. So thus we can be responsible, truly responsible. This only holds if the brain is chaotic when we make decisions and based on quantum events, which is a huge, enormous if. Now, compatibilists might say, indeed does say, like Daniel Dennett, let's say there wasn't this quantum randomness, but some determinate process, like a random number generator is determinate randomness in computers. It would function exactly the same. No one would know any difference. It wouldn't feel any difference to anybody. It wouldn't function any different in the world. So how can this little quantum event, rather than a deterministic random number generator, make any difference at all to whether we should be responsible for our lives or not? That's the compatibilist reply. So, that is the libertarian position. Just define libertarianism to the person next to you and say if any argument there intrigued you. Okay, we're a little bit pushed for time. So now just sum up with the person next to you. What do you think, if you feel you have a preference? Do we or could we have free will and moral responsibility?